Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I'm dipping into the archives again to revisit a project that's over 10 years in the making, and whose most recent update was about 4 years ago. Now if you guessed Princess Leia's bounty hunter helmet from Return of the Jedi, you'd be right. So rather than wait a second longer, let's get into it.
The paint job on this helmet from 4 years ago isn't bad, but I've spent the last 4 years learning and improving my skills, and I think I can do better. So I start with a bit of the reddish brown that makes up the base color to give the entire helmet, aside from the silver visor opening, a bit of a refresh. I'm not going for a completely new base layer. I just want to break up the surface a bit to give it a more mottled appearance. When I'm happy with the coverage, I mix up a bit of light gray and isopropyl alcohol to create a thin wash, and then repeat the previous step. I'm trying to bring sort of a dusty look to the helmet, but I also want to be able to still see that patchy paint variation too. Having more reference photos really helped make this process a lot easier, but it also made me realize that accurate and idealized aren't always the same. So I'm doing my best to walk the line between the two, leaning more heavily on what this helmet looks like when I think about it, rather than trying to make it match a bunch of photos taken with multiple cameras and lenses and under a variety of lighting scenarios, since those three things can cause the appearance to look wildly different from image to image. Once it was starting to come more in line with my idea of the helmet, I grabbed some pewter rub and buff and gave the side greeblies a touch-up, since the brown and gray paints had dulled them down a bit. It doesn't take much for this rub and buff to bring out the details in these parts, so you'll really want to sneak up on it should you ever need to use this for a project of your own. Another detail that was dulled in the paint application was all of the metal chipping effects. When I painted this 4 years ago, I did all of these with aluminum metallic paint and a brush. But this time around, I'm going with my tried and true silver marker approach. Ideally, I'd be using an ultra-fine point marker, but the point on this one is alright for this application, and if I feel like it needs a bit more definition, I can always go back and add more at a later date. At this point, I wasn't completely sold on my paint application, but thought if I could blot away some of the paint with a brush and some solvent, it might leave me with a more organic look that was closer to what I was after. It was a risky move, and I didn't film the process, but thankfully Mrs. Van Oaks is always at the ready for a dramatic reenactment. With that squared away, I could start on the leather work. Years ago I purchased a kit that included these pre-cut pieces. Now it was just up to me to glue them in place, starting with a bit of CA glue along the upper ridge to hold down the edge. Once that was in place, I grabbed an ancient can of contact cement and applied it to the helmet and the leather, and after a few minutes could bond them together, making sure to smooth it out towards the front to remove any air pockets. To make sure that the material doesn't lift, I ran some more CA glue along the edges and then could trim off any excess. This was an absolute must around the nose, since there's a piece that needs to fit into the inset, and so I made sure to trim back as much as I could, but still keeping enough of the leather to ensure a lasting bond. A quick test fit of the nose greeblie, and then I could get on with the rest of the leather wrap. The method for the lower jaw is the same as the upper. It just includes tucking the material under the lip of the helmet and gluing it in place. Thankfully, this material is pliable and took to the curves of the helmet with minimal bunching. When the first round of leather work was done, I shifted my attention to the nose greeblie. This piece is supposed to be chromed, so I'll start with a layer of high-gloss varnish applied with my airbrush at around 15 psi. The varnish was allowed to dry for an hour, and then it was time for the chrome paint, which was also applied at low air pressure. And when the part was dry, I grabbed my glue and got it set in position in the helmet. Now I definitely had to work for it, since the wrapping made for a tight fit, but once it was in position, there was no getting it back out. Next up is this back cover piece. I picked up a fresh can of contact cement and then applied it to a few spots on the leather, as well as some corresponding points inside the helmet. And once it was tacky, I could press it into place. And while the framing of this shot is terrible, the installation turned out pretty well, and I could move on to the strap piece that goes around the back of the helmet. Off camera, I painted and dry brushed these greeblies with more of the pewter rub and buff, and they'll get glued to this bit of strapping with contact cement.
Hey gang, it's me again. This week's video doesn't have a sponsor, so I wanted to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters who really make these videos possible. If you've ever found these videos to be helpful or inspiring over the years, please consider becoming a patron so that I can continue to bring you a new video every week. Thanks.
Once the glue had set up, I could affix the end points of the strap to the sides of the helmet with a bit more contact cement, and then I was finished with the soft goods portion of this project. Now that I'm in the home stretch on this helmet, I can get to tackling the antenna. This resin cast piece was painted black and dry brushed with rub and buff before being knocked back with a bit of isopropyl alcohol. Then I secured it in place with a small screw from inside of the helmet. The smaller metallic detail piece was painted just like the nose detail, with the black base, gloss clear, and chrome, and needs to be installed over the small metal post with a bit of CA glue. And then I'm calling this one done. For now.
Now sadly, I don't have the right lens material on hand to complete this build, but this is the single biggest improvement this helmet's seen in 4 years, and I'm okay with that. And while I know Boushh may not be what you're working on, hopefully some of the techniques I used will come in handy on a project of your own. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.